The desert sun beat down mercilessly on the rocky terrain of eastern Afghanistan. Captain Jake Morrison wiped the sweat from his forehead as he scanned the horizon through his binoculars. His unit, Echo Company, had been on patrol for 3 days, tracking a group of insurgents who had been attacking supply convoys in the region. Morrison's radio crackled to life. Echo 6, this is Bravo 2. We have eyes on multiple hostiles moving through the valley below your position. Estimate 40 to 50 fighters, heavily armed. Morrison grabbed his radio. Copy that, Bravo 2. Can you confirm their direction of movement? They're heading straight for the village of Kostmatin. Looks like they're planning something big, sir. Morrison felt his stomach tighten. Kostmatin was home to over 300 civilians, mostly families with young children. Intelligence reports had indicated that insurgent groups in the area were planning attacks on villages that cooperated with coalition forces. This village had recently allowed a medical team to set up a clinic there. All call signs, this is Echo 6, Morrison spoke into his radio. We're moving to intercept hostile forces before they reach the village. Alpha Team, take the high ground on the north ridge. Bravo Team, circle around to the east. Charlie Team, you're with me down the middle. The 847 Marines of Echo Company moved swiftly through the mountainous terrain. They had trained for exactly this type of mission countless times back at Camp Pendleton. Each Marine knew their job and trusted the men fighting beside them. Sergeant Maria Santos, a medic with Alpha Team, adjusted her heavy pack as she climbed the steep slope toward the north ridge. She had joined the Marines 4 years ago, fresh out of high school in San Antonio, Texas. Her father had been a Marine, and her brother was currently serving in the Navy. Military service ran in her family's blood. Santos, you keeping up back there? Called out Corporal Williams, the team leader. Roger that, Corporal. Right behind you, she replied, though her legs were burning from the climb. As Alpha Team reached their position on the ridge, Santos pulled out her scope to survey the valley below. What she saw made her blood run cold. The insurgent force was much larger than initially reported. She counted at least 80 fighters, and they were moving with military precision. This wasn't a ragtag group of locals with old weapons. These were well-trained militants with modern equipment. Corporal Williams, she whispered urgently. You need to see this. Williams took the scope and studied the valley for several long minutes. His face grew grim as he realized what they were up against. He immediately radioed Captain Morrison. Echo 6, Alpha Team Leader. We have a problem. Enemy force is significantly larger than reported. I count 80 fighters minimum, possibly more. They have vehicles, heavy weapons, and are moving in coordinated formations. Morrison's voice came back tense. Copy that, Alpha Leader. Are you certain of your count? Affirmative, sir. These aren't local fighters. This looks like a trained military unit. Morrison quickly called for a status update from all teams. Bravo Team reported similar observations from their position. The enemy was not only larger than expected, but they were also better equipped and organized. Morrison realized his Marines were walking into a potential ambush. All teams, this is Echo 6. Change of plans. We're going to set up defensive positions and call for backup. These numbers are not in our favor for a direct assault. But, as Morrison spoke those words, the sound of gunfire erupted from the valley below. The insurgents had spotted the Marines and were already moving to surround them. Within minutes, Morrison could see enemy fighters climbing the hills on all sides, cutting off escape routes. Private First Class Tommy Chen was part of Charlie Team with Captain Morrison. At 19 years old, he was one of the youngest Marines in the company. He had joined the Marines after graduating high school in Los Angeles, inspired by stories his grandfather told him about serving in Vietnam. Contact left. Chen shouted as he spotted muzzle flashes coming from a cluster of rocks about 200 meters away. He quickly took aim with his M4 rifle and returned fire. The firefight intensified rapidly. What had started as a routine patrol mission was quickly turning into a full-scale battle. The Marines found themselves scattered across 3 different hill positions, each team fighting to hold their ground while enemy fighters closed in from multiple directions. Morrison tried to establish radio contact with headquarters to request immediate air support and reinforcements. But the mountainous terrain was interfering with radio communications. His calls were met with static and broken transmissions. Echo 6, this is headquarters, can barely, your transmission, repeat your, over. Headquarters, this is Echo 6. We are under heavy enemy fire. Request immediate air support and ground reinforcements. We are outnumbered 3-1. How copy? Echo 6, negative copy, communications, compromised. Morrison realized they were on their own. His 847 Marines were surrounded by a superior enemy force in rough terrain with limited ammunition and supplies. The nearest friendly base was over 50 miles away, and radio communications were failing. As bullets whizzed past his position, Morrison made a difficult decision. All teams, establish defensive perimeters and conserve ammunition. We're going to have to hold our positions until help arrives. Sergeant Santos bandaged a wounded Marine while bullets ricocheted off the rocks around her position. How's the pain, Rodriguez? She asked as she applied pressure to a bullet wound in his shoulder. I've had worse hangovers, Doc, Rodriguez replied through gritted teeth, trying to keep morale up despite the dire situation. Santos knew they needed medical evacuation for the wounded, but, with the enemy surrounding them, no helicopter could safely land. She had already treated 6 wounded Marines, and the fighting had only been going on for 30 minutes. The afternoon sun was beginning to set behind the mountains, and Morrison knew that fighting in darkness would only make their situation worse. The enemy had the advantage of knowing the terrain, and night vision equipment was limited among his Marines. Alpha Team, what's your ammunition status? Morrison called over the radio. Running low, sir. Down to about 40%. Bravo Team? Same here, Echo 6. Maybe 50% if we're lucky. Morrison did the math in his head. At their current rate of fire, they would be out of ammunition within 2 hours. The enemy showed no signs of retreating and seemed content to wait them out. They were effectively trapped. As darkness fell over the Afghan mountains, the 847 Marines of Echo Company prepared for what might be the longest night of their lives. They were cornered, outnumbered, and running low on ammunition. But they were Marines, and they would fight to the end. Little did they know that 60 miles away, Chief Warrant Officer Sarah Mitchell was preparing her AH-64 Apache helicopter for what would become the most important mission of her military career. Chief Warrant Officer Sarah Mitchell adjusted her flight helmet and ran through her pre-flight checklist for the 3rd time. Something felt different tonight at Forward Operating Base Thunder, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she would be needed soon. Her AH-64 Apache helicopter, callsign Devil 21, sat ready on the flight line under the bright floodlights. Mitchell had been flying Apache helicopters for 8 years. She grew up on a farm in Kansas, where her father taught her to fly crop dusters when she was just 16. After high school, she joined the Army and quickly proved herself as one of the most skilled pilots in her unit. She was among the first women to fly Apache helicopters in combat, and she had earned the respect of every pilot and ground crew member on the base. Mitchell, you don't have to baby that bird. She's ready to fly, called out Sergeant Martinez, her crew chief, as he finished loading 30mm ammunition into the helicopter's cannon. I know, Martinez. But I'd rather check everything twice than crash once, she replied, continuing her inspection of the aircraft's weapons systems. The Apache was loaded with its full complement of weapons, 1,200 rounds of 30mm high-explosive ammunition, 16 Hellfire missiles, and 76 2.75-inch rockets. It was enough firepower to level a small building, and Mitchell knew how to use every bit of it. Her co-pilot and weapons officer, Captain James Park, climbed into the front seat of the Apache. Park was a graduate of West Point who had been flying with Mitchell for 6 months. Despite his formal military education, he had learned more about combat flying from Mitchell than from any textbook. Any word on tonight's mission? Park asked as he strapped himself in. Nothing official yet, but I have a feeling we'll be flying soon. Communications have been acting up all day, and there are rumors of units out on patrol that haven't checked in. At that moment, both pilots heard the base alarm system activate. 3 long blasts followed by 2 short ones, the signal for immediate combat readiness. Within seconds, Mitchell and Park were running through their start-up procedures. Major Collins, the squadron commander, came running across the flight line.
Mitchell, we have a situation.
Echo Company is pinned down in the mountains near Cost Matin.
They're surrounded and taking heavy casualties.
Radio communications are spotty, but we know they need immediate air support.
Mitchell's heart raced as she processed the information. Echo Company was 847 Marines, the entire unit.
If they were surrounded and taking casualties, it meant potentially hundreds of American lives were at stake.
What's the enemy situation, sir?
Mitchell asked as she continued starting up the helicopter's engines. Unknown numbers, but reports suggest they're heavily armed and well organized. The Marines have been under fire for over 4 hours now. 2 other aircraft have already attempted to reach them but were turned back by heavy anti-aircraft fire.
Park looked up from his weapons console. Sir, if 2 aircraft have already been turned back, what makes you think we can get through? Major Collins met Park's gaze. Because you're flying with the best Apache pilot in the Army. Mitchell has never failed to complete a mission.
Mitchell felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. She had flown dozens of combat missions, but never with so many lives depending on her. The Apache's engines were now at full power, and all systems showed green.
Devil 2-1 is ready for takeoff, Mitchell announced over the radio.
Devil 2-1, you are cleared for immediate departure. Good luck, and bring our Marines home. Mitchell pulled the helicopter into the air and immediately turned toward the mountains. The flight to the Marines' location would take 45 minutes at maximum speed. She pushed the Apache to its limits, flying low through valleys and canyons to avoid enemy radar. As they flew through the night, Park monitored radio communications, trying to establish contact with the surrounded Marines. The radio crackled with broken transmissions and static.
Echo 6. Devil 2-1, respond, heavy casualties, ammunition running low.
I'm getting pieces of transmissions, but nothing clear, Park reported. It sounds like they're in serious trouble.
Mitchell flew faster, knowing that every minute counted.
The Apache's navigation system showed they were 20 minutes away from the target area. She began planning her approach, knowing that the element of surprise would be their only advantage.
Park, start warming up the targeting system. We'll likely have multiple enemy positions to engage simultaneously.
Roger. Hellfire missiles are armed and ready.
Cannon is loaded with high explosive rounds.
As they approached the target area, Mitchell could see muzzle flashes lighting up 3 different hilltops. The Marines were clearly surrounded, with enemy fire coming from multiple directions. She could also see several small fires burning, which likely meant vehicles or equipment had been hit.
Devil 2-1, this is Echo 6. Thank God you're here. We are surrounded on 3 sides with approximately 100 enemy fighters.
We have multiple casualties and are low on ammunition. Mitchell's radio had finally connected with Captain Morrison. His voice sounded strained but determined.
Echo 6, Devil 2-1. I see your position. Can you mark enemy locations with flares? Negative, Devil 2-1. We used our last flares 2 hours ago.
Enemy is concentrated on hill to our north, east, and south.
We're on the center hill.
Mitchell studied the terrain below through her night vision system. She could distinguish between the Marines' positions and the enemy fighters by their firing patterns and movements. The Marines were clearly in defensive positions, while the enemy was maneuvering to close the distance. Park, I need target designations on the northern hill first.
That's where the heaviest concentration appears to be.
Park worked quickly with his targeting computer, identifying multiple enemy positions.
I have 12 targets on the northern hill.
Mix of individual fighters and what appears to be a heavy machine gun position. Mitchell maneuvered the Apache into attack position.
Echo 6, keep your heads down. We're coming in hot.
She dove the helicopter toward the northern hill at high speed.
The Apache's cannon opened fire first, sending 30mm high explosive rounds into enemy positions.
The night sky lit up with explosions as the rounds found their targets. Enemy fighters scrambled for cover as Mitchell unleashed a barrage of rocket fire. 16 2.75-inch rockets streaked through the darkness, creating a series of explosions that could be heard for miles. But the enemy was ready for air attack. As Mitchell pulled the Apache up from its attack run, tracer rounds from anti-aircraft guns began streaking past the helicopter.
"We've got AAA!"
Park shouted, referring to anti-aircraft artillery. Heavy caliber, probably 23 millimeters. Mitchell threw the Apache into evasive maneuvers, using the mountainous terrain to break the enemy's line of sight. But she knew that the anti-aircraft fire meant the enemy was well prepared and heavily armed. "Echo 6, what's your casualty status?"
Mitchell asked as she circled around for another attack run. "Devil 2-1, we have 18 wounded, 4 critical.
We need medical evacuation, but no way to establish a landing zone with current enemy fire."
Mitchell realized that destroying the enemy positions wasn't enough.
She needed to create a safe corridor for medical helicopters to land and evacuate the wounded Marines.
That would require eliminating not just some of the enemy, but all of them. "Park, how much ammunition do we have left?"
"We're down to about 60% after that first run. We've got plenty of Hellfire missiles left, but we need to be more precise with our cannon rounds."
Mitchell looked down at the Marines' position. She could see Marines moving between rocky outcroppings, some carrying wounded comrades.
The enemy fire was intensifying, and she knew that the Marines couldn't hold out much longer.
The female Apache pilot realized that she was their only hope. 2 other aircraft had failed to break through the enemy defenses.
If she couldn't find a way to eliminate the enemy forces surrounding the Marines, 847 American soldiers would be overrun before dawn. Mitchell circled the Apache around the backside of the eastern hill, using the terrain to mask her approach from the anti-aircraft guns. She knew that a direct assault would only expose her helicopter to more enemy fire. She needed a different strategy. "Park, I need you to identify their anti-aircraft positions. If we can take those out first, we'll have a better chance of eliminating the other enemy fighters." Park studied his targeting display carefully.
"I count 3 anti-aircraft positions.
1 on the northern hill, 1 on the eastern ridge, and 1 on the southern slope.
They're positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire."
"Smart positioning," Mitchell acknowledged. "They knew we'd come to help the Marines, and they were ready for us." On the ground, Captain Morrison was coordinating his Marines' defense while staying in contact with the Apache pilot. His ammunition situation was becoming critical, and more Marines were being wounded as the enemy continued their assault.
"Alpha Team, what's your ammunition status?" Morrison radioed.
"Down to 20 rounds per man, sir," came the reply from Corporal Williams.
"Bravo Team?"
"Same here, Echo 6. Maybe 15 rounds each." Morrison knew they were approaching the point where his Marines would have to fix bayonets and prepare for hand-to-hand combat. But 847 Marines with bayonets against 100 enemy fighters with automatic weapons was not a fight they could win. Sergeant Santos was treating another wounded Marine when a bullet struck the rock inches from her head, sending stone fragments flying.
"Rodriguez, I need you to help me move Thompson. He's hit bad and bleeding too much."
Rodriguez, despite his own shoulder wound, helped Santos drag the unconscious Marine behind better cover.
"Doc, how many more can you patch up? We're running out of medical supplies."
"I've got enough bandages for maybe 5 more Marines. After that, we'll have to start tearing up uniforms for tourniquets." High above, Mitchell was planning her attack on the anti-aircraft positions. She knew she would only get 1 chance at each target before they would adjust their positions and increase their fire.
"Park, lock onto the northern anti-aircraft position first."
"I'm going to come in fast and low from the west."
"Roger."
Hellfire missile locked on target. Mitchell dove the Apache down into the valley, flying barely 50 feet above the rocky ground. The helicopter's speed and low altitude made it nearly invisible to enemy radar and difficult to target with anti-aircraft guns. As she approached the northern hill, Mitchell pulled the Apache up sharply and fired a Hellfire missile. The precision-guided weapon struck the anti-aircraft position directly, creating a massive explosion that silenced the enemy guns.
Direct hit, Park announced. Northern anti-aircraft position is eliminated.
But the success was short-lived. Enemy fighters on the eastern and southern hills immediately opened fire with rocket-propelled grenades. Mitchell saw the trails of smoke from multiple RPGs heading directly toward her helicopter. "RPGs incoming," she shouted, throwing the Apache into a steep diving turn. The rocket-propelled grenades exploded harmlessly behind the helicopter, but Mitchell knew that her luck wouldn't last forever.
The enemy had too many weapons systems, and she was operating alone. Devil 2-1, this is Echo 6. Enemy forces are massing for a final assault on our position. We count approximately 60 fighters moving up the hill toward us. Mitchell's blood ran cold. If the enemy reached the Marines' position, the fighting would become hand-to-hand combat where air support would be ineffective. She had to stop the assault before it reached her fellow soldiers.
"Park, forget the anti-aircraft guns for now. I need to stop that infantry assault." Mitchell turned the Apache toward the eastern hill where the main enemy assault was taking place. Through her night vision system, she could see enemy fighters climbing steadily toward the Marines' defensive positions. She opened fire with the Apache's 30mm cannon, walking the explosive rounds up the hillside toward the advancing enemy fighters. The high explosive shells created a series of devastating explosions, stopping the advance temporarily. But, as soon as Mitchell pulled the Apache away to avoid return fire, the enemy assault resumed. There were too many fighters, and they were using covered routes up the hillside that made targeting difficult. "Echo 6, I need your Marines to mark the closest enemy positions with anything that will create light. Gunfire, grenades, anything. Devil 2-1, we're critically low on grenades, but I'll see what we can do." Morrison ordered his Marines to concentrate their remaining ammunition on the enemy fighters closest to their position. The muzzle flashes from their rifles created brief illumination that helped Mitchell identify targets. Private Chen was down to his last magazine when he spotted enemy fighters only 30 meters from the Marines' position.
"Captain, they're almost on top of us."
Morrison drew his sidearm, knowing that the final phase of the battle was about to begin. "All Marines, fix bayonets and prepare for close combat." The order sent chills through every Marine on the hilltop. They all knew what it meant. When Marines were ordered to fix bayonets, it meant they were about to fight for their lives with knives attached to their rifles. Mitchell heard Morrison's order over the radio and realized that she was running out of time. The Apache's ammunition was getting low, and she still hadn't eliminated the anti-aircraft threats that prevented other aircraft from joining the fight.
"Park, how many Hellfire missiles do we have left?" 6 missiles remaining, plus about 200 rounds for the cannon."
Mitchell made a critical decision. Instead of trying to eliminate individual enemy fighters, she would target the hilltops themselves, creating landslides that would bury enemy positions and cut off their advance routes. "Park, target the rocky outcropping on the eastern hill, about 50 meters above the enemy assault force."
"But that's danger close to our Marines," Park warned. "If we miscalculate, if we don't try something different, those Marines are going to be overrun in 5 minutes."
Park reluctantly locked onto the rocky formation.
"Hellfire missile armed and ready."
"Echo 6, danger close fire mission incoming on the eastern hill.
Get your Marines down and hold on."
Mitchell fired the Hellfire missile at the rocky outcropping. The explosion was enormous, much larger than she had expected. The missile had apparently hit some kind of natural gas pocket in the rock formation, creating a secondary explosion that shook the entire hillside. Tons of rock and debris came crashing down the eastern slope, burying enemy fighters and blocking their advance routes. The landslide continued for over a minute, completely changing the terrain of the battlefield.
"Holy shit!" Park exclaimed. "That worked better than we hoped."
But their celebration was short-lived. The remaining anti-aircraft positions opened fire simultaneously, and this time their aim was more accurate.
Mitchell heard the distinctive sound of bullets hitting the Apache's armor.
"We're taking hits," she announced as warning lights began flashing on her instrument panel.
The helicopter shuddered as more bullets found their mark.
Mitchell could feel the aircraft becoming harder to control as damage accumulated to critical flight systems.
"Engine temperature rising," Park reported.
"We're losing hydraulic pressure." Mitchell knew that the Apache was tough, but it couldn't take much more damage and remain airborne. She had to make every shot count because this might be her last attack run. Below on the ground, the Marines watched as their only air support aircraft struggled to stay in the air. They could see tracers from anti-aircraft fire reaching up toward the Apache, and they knew that their survival depended on the courage of the female pilot who refused to abandon them. Mitchell fought to keep the damaged Apache in the air as hydraulic fluid leaked from multiple bullet holes. The helicopter's flight controls were becoming increasingly unresponsive, and she knew that landing might soon become mandatory rather than optional. "Park, give me a damage assessment," she called out while wrestling with the aircraft's controls. "Primary hydraulic system is down to 40%. Engine temperature is in the red zone, and we've lost our backup navigation computer."
The good news is that all weapon systems are still operational. Mitchell grimaced. The Apache could still fight, but for how much longer?
She looked down at the battlefield and saw that the landslide had only temporarily stopped the enemy assault. New groups of fighters were already finding alternate routes up the hillside toward the Marines. On the ground, Captain Morrison was coordinating what he knew might be his unit's last stand. The landslide had bought them precious time, but enemy forces were regrouping and preparing for another assault. "All teams, sound off with ammunition status," Morrison radioed.
"Alpha team has 0 rifle ammunition."
"We're down to sidearms only," reported Corporal Williams. "Bravo team, same situation.
5 rounds per pistol if we're lucky."
"Charlie team has maybe 10 rifle rounds total." Morrison felt his heart sink. His Marines had fought bravely for over 6 hours, but they were essentially out of ammunition.
They still had their bayonets and their determination, but that might not be enough against 100 enemy fighters.
Sergeant Santos had used the last of her medical supplies treating wounded Marines. She was now caring for 26 casualties, including 8 who were critically wounded and needed immediate evacuation.
"Captain, I've got Marines here who won't survive much longer without proper medical care," she reported.
"Rodriguez lost consciousness 10 minutes ago, and Thompson's pulse is getting weaker." Morrison knew that even if they survived the next enemy assault, his wounded Marines would die without medical evacuation. But no medevac helicopter could land while enemy forces controlled the surrounding hills. High above, Mitchell was developing a desperate plan. With her helicopter damaged and ammunition running low, conventional tactics weren't going to work.
She needed to do something that the enemy wouldn't expect.
"Park, I'm going to try something that's not in the manual," she announced.
"What do you have in mind?"
"I'm going to land this Apache right on top of the Marines' position and use it as a stationary gun platform.
We'll provide close-in fire support while other aircraft attempt to rescue."
Park stared at her in disbelief.
"Land? On a mountaintop? Under enemy fire? With a damaged helicopter?"
"It's the only way to provide continuous fire support. If we stay airborne much longer, we'll crash anyway when the engine overheats." Mitchell began her approach to the Marines' hilltop position. The Apache was never designed to land on rough terrain, especially not on a rocky mountainside. But she had been flying helicopters for 8 years and had made emergency landings in worse conditions.
"Echo 6, this is Devil 2-1. I'm coming in for an emergency landing on your position.
Clear a space for my aircraft."
Morrison couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Devil 2-1, say again?"
"Did you say landing?"
"Affirmative, Echo 6.
My aircraft is damaged, and this is our best option for continued fire support." Morrison immediately ordered his Marines to clear rocks and debris from a small flat area near the center of their defensive perimeter. It wasn't much space, but it might be enough for an experienced pilot. Mitchell approached the hilltop slowly, fighting the damaged helicopter's tendency to drift to the left. The Apache's landing gear was designed for flat runways and prepared helipads, not rocky mountainsides. Enemy fighters saw the helicopter attempting to land and immediately concentrated their fire on the slow-moving target. Bullets struck the Apache's armor plating, creating showers of sparks in the darkness. Taking heavy fire, Park announced unnecessarily, as both pilots could hear bullets hitting their aircraft. Mitchell ignored the enemy fire and concentrated on her landing. The Apache touched down hard on the rocky surface, bouncing twice before settling onto its landing gear. She immediately shut down the damaged engine to prevent a fire. "We're down," she announced over the radio. Devil 2-1 is now a stationary weapons platform. The Marines cheered when they saw the Apache land safely on their position. For the first time in hours, they had hoped that they might survive the night. But Mitchell knew that landing the helicopter was only the beginning. Now she had to use the Apache's remaining weapons to break the enemy siege before sunrise. Enemy forces would undoubtedly launch another assault as soon as they realized the helicopter was grounded. "Park, rotate the turret to face the southern hill. That's where their heaviest concentration is now." The Apache's 30mm cannon could still rotate and fire even with the helicopter on the ground. Park targeted enemy positions on the southern slope and opened fire, sending high-explosive rounds into groups of advancing fighters. Enemy return fire was immediate and intense. The grounded Apache made an obvious target, and every enemy fighter seemed to be shooting at it. Bullets ricocheted off the helicopter's armored cockpit, creating a constant rattling sound. Mitchell realized that the Apache's armor could protect them from small arms fire, but if the enemy had rocket-propelled grenades or anti-tank weapons, they would be sitting ducks. "Park, we need to take out that remaining anti-aircraft position before they bring up heavier weapons." "Roger. I have a target lock on the eastern ridge. Hellfire missile ready. Fire." The missile streaked away from the grounded Apache and struck the anti-aircraft position with devastating accuracy. The explosion lit up the entire battlefield and silenced the enemy guns permanently. With 2 anti-aircraft positions destroyed, Mitchell hoped that other aircraft might now be able to reach their position. She tried to contact headquarters on the radio. "Any station, this is Devil 2-1. We are grounded on the Marines' position and have eliminated 2 anti-aircraft sites. Request immediate medevac and reinforcement." The response came through clearly for the first time all night. "Devil 2-1, this is headquarters. We have multiple aircraft en route to your position. ETA 15 minutes. Mitchell felt a surge of relief. Help was finally coming. But 15 minutes was a lifetime in combat, and she could see enemy forces massing for what appeared to be a final assault on the Marines' position. "Park, how many Hellfire missiles do we have left?" "4 missiles and about 100 rounds for the cannon." Mitchell looked out at the battlefield. There were still dozens of enemy fighters surrounding their position, and more seemed to be arriving from the south. 4 missiles and 100 cannon rounds might not be enough to stop a determined assault by that many fighters. Echo 6, prepare your Marines for incoming fire support. We're going to hit them with everything we have left. Captain Morrison smiled for the first time all night. "Roger, Devil 2-1. My Marines are ready to follow your lead." The female Apache pilot prepared to make her final stand alongside 847 Marines on a mountaintop in Afghanistan. She had already accomplished the impossible by landing a damaged helicopter under enemy fire. Now she had to hold off 100 enemy fighters for 15 more minutes until reinforcements arrived. Mitchell checked her weapons one more time and prepared to fight the most important battle of her military career. Mitchell watched through her targeting system as enemy fighters began their final assault. They were coming from 3 directions simultaneously, using the darkness and rocky terrain for cover. She estimated at least 70 fighters were participating in the attack. "Park, priority targets are the groups moving up from the south. They're closest to our wounded Marines." "Roger. Engaging southern targets first." The Apache's cannon opened fire, sending 30mm high-explosive rounds into the advancing enemy fighters. Each round created a small explosion that could be seen clearly through the night vision system. Enemy fighters dove for cover as the shells exploded around them. Captain Morrison coordinated his Marines' defense while staying close to the grounded Apache. His men were down to their last few rounds of ammunition, but their morale had improved dramatically since the helicopter landed.
Alpha Team, the enemy is trying to flank us from the north. Use your remaining ammunition to stop their advance.
Corporal Williams and his Marines opened fire with their few remaining bullets. Each shot had to count, as they had no ammunition to waste. Williams personally dropped 2 enemy fighters who had gotten within 20 meters of the Marines' position. Private Chen was helping Sergeant Santos move wounded Marines to better cover behind the Apache when he spotted enemy fighters climbing up the eastern slope.
Sergeant Santos. Enemy fighters coming up the backside.
Santos looked up from bandaging a Marine's leg wound and saw 3 enemy fighters only 50 meters away. She drew her sidearm and fired 4 quick shots, hitting one fighter and forcing the others to take cover. Chen, help me get these wounded Marines behind the helicopter.
They'll have better protection there.
Mitchell saw the enemy fighters approaching from the east and rotated the Apache's cannon to engage them.
Park, targets to the east. Danger close to our position. I see them.
Engaging with cannon fire. The 30mm rounds exploded just meters from the Marines' position, but the Apache's targeting system was precise enough to avoid hitting friendly forces.
The enemy fighters on the eastern slope were eliminated quickly.
But Mitchell could see that more enemy forces were moving up from the valley below.
For every fighter they eliminated, 2 more seemed to take their place.
The enemy was throwing everything they had at this final assault.
Echo 6, what's your estimate on total enemy forces? Mitchell asked over the radio.
Double 2-1, we're seeing at least 80 fighters now.
They're bringing up reinforcements from the valley.
Mitchell felt her heart race. 80 enemy fighters was more than she had ammunition to handle. She had 3 Hellfire missiles left and perhaps 60 rounds for the cannon.
That wasn't enough firepower to stop such a large force.
Park, we need to make these last missiles count. Target the largest groups of fighters you can identify. Park studied his targeting display and identified a group of approximately 15 enemy fighters advancing up the southern slope.
Large group moving up from the south. Distance 400 meters. Fire.
The Hellfire missile struck in the center of the enemy formation, creating a massive explosion that could be heard for miles.
When the smoke cleared, the entire group had been eliminated. Direct hit. Target destroyed.
But even as they celebrated the successful strike, Mitchell could see enemy fighters getting closer to the Marines' position. Some enemy forces had advanced to within 100 meters of the hilltop. Sergeant Santos was treating her 27th wounded Marine when bullets began striking the rocks around her position. "These guys are getting too close," she shouted to Chen. Chen grabbed a rifle from a wounded Marine and returned fire with the weapon's last magazine. His marksmanship training paid off as he dropped 2 enemy fighters who were advancing up the hill. Captain Morrison realized that his Marines were about to be overrun. "All Marines, prepare for hand-to-hand combat.
Fix bayonets."
The order echoed across the hilltop as 847 Marines prepared their bayonets for close combat. They had fought courageously for 7 hours, and they weren't going to surrender now. Mitchell heard Morrison's order and knew that she was down to her final minutes. If enemy fighters reached the Marines' position, air support would become ineffective due to the danger of hitting friendly forces. Park, fire the remaining Hellfire missiles at the 2 largest enemy groups.
Don't wait for perfect targeting. We're running out of time.
Park quickly identified targets and fired both remaining missiles in rapid succession.
The explosions illuminated the entire battlefield as the precision-guided weapons found their marks.
The missile strikes eliminated over 20 enemy fighters, but dozens more continued advancing toward the Marines' position.
Mitchell could see enemy fighters only 70 meters away from her helicopter. Park switched to cannon fire.
"We need to create a defensive barrier around our position." Mitchell began firing the Apache's cannon in a circular pattern around the Marines' hilltop position, creating a ring of explosive rounds that enemy fighters couldn't cross.
Each 30mm shell created a small crater and deadly shrapnel that forced enemy forces to seek cover. But the cannon ammunition was running low quickly.
Mitchell watched the round counter drop towards 0, 50 rounds, 40, 30, 20.
"Mitchell, I can see enemy fighters massing for a final rush," Park reported.
"They're going to wait for us to run out of ammunition, then attack from all sides."
Mitchell looked at the ammunition counter, 15 rounds remaining.
Once those were gone, the Apache would be defenseless, and the Marines would have to fight hand-to-hand against overwhelming odds.
"Echo 6, what's the ETA on our reinforcements?" she asked desperately.
Devil 2-1, headquarters says aircraft are 5 minutes out.
"Can you hold for 5 more minutes?"
Mitchell looked at her ammunition counter again, 10 rounds. 5 minutes was an eternity in combat, especially when you were almost out of ammunition.
"Echo 6, we'll hold as long as we can."
Mitchell used the Apache's final cannon rounds to target the enemy fighters closest to the Marines' position. Each round had to eliminate at least one enemy fighter, or the mathematics of the battle would turn hopeless.
Round counter, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. The Apache's cannon was empty.
Mitchell and Park sat in their armored cockpit, defenseless against the enemy forces surrounding them. The only weapons they had left were their personal sidearms.
"Park, draw your weapon.
We might have to fight our way out of this cockpit." But, as Mitchell prepared for a final firefight, she heard the most beautiful sound in the world, the roar of jet engines overhead.
"Echo 6, this is Lightning Flight. We have 4 F-16 Fighting Falcons loaded with cluster bombs and 20mm cannon ammunition. Request target designations."
Captain Morrison grabbed his radio with trembling hands. "Lightning Flight, enemy forces are surrounding our hilltop position at all points.
We are in the center with a grounded Apache helicopter.
Danger close fire mission authorized." The F-16 fighters dove toward the battlefield with their cannons blazing.
High explosive 20mm rounds tore through enemy positions with devastating effect.
The sound of the aircraft's guns was like thunder rolling across the mountains. Enemy fighters who had been advancing confidently toward the Marines' position suddenly found themselves under attack by 4 fighter jets. The cluster bombs created massive explosions that eliminated entire groups of enemy fighters simultaneously. Within 10 minutes, the battlefield fell silent except for the sound of aircraft engines overhead. The enemy force that had surrounded 847 Marines for 8 hours had been eliminated completely.
"Echo 6, this is Lightning Flight. Battlefield appears secure. We have medevac helicopters en route for your wounded."
Mitchell slumped back in her pilot's seat, exhausted from the longest night of her military career. She had flown a damaged Apache helicopter into combat, landed on a mountaintop under enemy fire, and held off 100 enemy fighters until reinforcements arrived.
"Devil 2-1, this is Echo 6. I don't know how to thank you.
You saved 847 Marines tonight." Mitchell smiled as she watched medevac helicopters landing to evacuate the wounded Marines.
"Echo 6, we're all on the same team.
Marines don't leave Marines behind, and neither do Army pilots." As the sun rose over the Afghan mountains, the successful rescue mission was already becoming legend. The story of how a female Apache pilot landed her helicopter on a mountaintop and single-handedly held off 100 enemy fighters would be told in military academies for years to come.
Sergeant Santos supervised the loading of wounded Marines onto medevac helicopters. All 27 casualties survived their wounds and would eventually return to duty. Private Chen was awarded the Bronze Star for his actions during the battle.
Captain Morrison recommended Chief Warrant Officer Sarah Mitchell for the Distinguished Flying Cross, the highest award for heroism in aerial combat. Her courage and skill had saved 847 Marine lives in one of the most remarkable rescue missions in military history. 6 months later, Mitchell was promoted and given command of her own Apache squadron. She continued flying combat missions for 3 more years before retiring to become a flight instructor. She never spoke publicly about the mission that made her famous, preferring to let her actions speak for themselves. The 847 Marines of Echo Company returned to the United States after completing their deployment in Afghanistan. They never forgot the female Apache pilot who refused to abandon them when they were surrounded and outnumbered. Many of them stayed in contact with Mitchell for years after the war, considering her an honorary Marine. The mountaintop where the battle took place was later named Mitchell's Peak by the Marines who fought there. A small monument was erected to commemorate the courage of all the soldiers who participated in the 8-hour battle. The story became a reminder that in the United States military, heroes come in all forms. Sometimes the most important person in a battle is not the one carrying a rifle, but the one behind the controls of an aircraft, willing to risk everything to save fellow Americans in danger. Chief Warrant Officer Sarah Mitchell had proven that night that courage knows no gender, and that the bond between American service members is stronger than any enemy force they might face.